let's review what we've learned about solving quadratic equations. We'll do a summary of solving techniques for quadratic equations. When we were going through the different methods of solving the quadratic equations, we listed several of them. We said we can look at the quadratic equation and we can see if we can factor that to 0 and using that technique. Or if everything was if the variable was under a perfect square, we could use the square root property by taking the square root of each side. We could also complete the square to solve, and then finally the quadratic formula. What you can do with a problem, and so just a quick review of these methods. Where all the variables are within a perfect square, we want to use the technique of taking the square root of each side. That's the fastest, the quickest method. And just to remind you of that, we'll take the square root of each side. I have to say plus or minus the square root of the other side, and then we solve for the x. In this case, we'll add a 2 to each plus or minus the square root of 5 divided by 3, right? Let's take another example. Suppose we have 3x squared plus 5x minus 2 equals 0. If you can quickly determine that an equation in standard form with one side equal to 0, that if you think that it can be factored, then by all means use that. In this case, you might notice that because we have a minus, if we can factor it, the signs are going to be the same for, the signs are going to be different, I should say, for this trinomial. And you might notice that 3 times 2 is that is going to work, so that if we have x plus 2 and 3x minus 1, but again, I recommend that you check your factoring. 2 times 3x is 6x, x times minus 1 is minus x, so we do get a middle term which is 5x, and then finally 2 times minus 1 is a negative 2. Just as we did before, we can then set each factor equal to 0 and solve. X equals negative 2, x equals 1/3. So these two methods are fast and quick and efficient. If you can recognize that trying to factor an equation, because you can always use the quadratic formula. And be careful of making errors. For example, if you happen to have the following, if you have x squared minus 6x minus 7 equals, be careful about thinking, well, this is going to factor into x minus 7 times x plus 1, because on the other side you've got a 1. Even though that it is true that this is factoring for the left-hand side here, it doesn't help us at all because the other side is not equal to 0. And so this method leads us nowhere. But we can always use the quadratic formula with this. And it tells us we'd have to put this in standard form. X squared minus 6x minus 8 equals 0. Determine what a, b, and c are. In this case, a equals 1, b equals negative 6, and c equals negative 8. Formula, which if you will remember, and it's important to memorize this, is b squared minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. Right? Once you've decided what your numbers a, minus 6 plus or minus the square root of minus 6, the quantity squared, minus 4 times a times c. A happens to be 1, so this would be 2 times 1. Okay? You simplify that, and then you have the solutions for this particular problem. So of 36. Here we have plus 32 divided by 2, and so finally we can say x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 68 in this case divided by 2. But this can be simplified. At this point, what I wanted to be sure and review with you is that the quadratic formula has a negative right here, and be really careful when the b itself is negative, this will become a positive over here. Okay, so the quadratic formula works all the time. It's easy to use, but you're going to need to memorize it. The last technique, the one that we haven't talked about yet, is the one by completing the square. This technique in trying to solve a quadratic equation, you will notice that it's not an efficient technique. It takes a while. It's more involved. Use the other techniques, which are the following. Factoring, taking the square root of each side, if we can recognize both of those, and the quadratic works when we can factor the equation. Taking the square root of each side works if we can put the variable inside a perfect square, and the quadratic formula works all the time. Completing the square works all the time also, but it's not as efficient.